Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. This morning's briefing is not going to be about an individual so much as the condition of individuals, specifically black people as it relates to hate crimes. Now I'm going to start off by telling you something that you already know. Black people in America are being targeted by white supremacists, in uniform and not, and it's been this way for hundreds of years. But this is not happening today on Trump's watch. It's happening on Biden's watch. That's important, because we were told for the 4 years that Donald Trump was in office that the white supremacists having been emboldened and getting all brolic, it was specifically because of him, and once Biden was in there, something was going to be done about them. But of course, nothing was done at all. And people seem to conveniently forget the entire reason that Donald Trump was even able to become president was because of how demoralized voters, specifically black voters, had become with the failure of the Obama years. Now, how can all of these white supremacist attacks be happening right now at a fever pitch on Joe Biden's watch? Because these white supremacists know who he is. They know his track record. Black people may be in denial about it, but the enemy is not. And this goes double for what they know about Kamala Harris. Let's look at Harris's home base of San Francisco. Black people have been largely ethnically cleansed from that city, and it happened on her watch. She's been there 30 plus years. And the few remaining black San Franciscans are getting attacked openly on a daily basis during the Biden and Harris administration. Black people are the main and majority victims of hate crimes in America, but Kamala Harris wouldn't say a word about it, not even for her fellow black San Franciscans. Absolutely no talk about an anti-black hate crime law from her. And the enemy, from the police to these ununiformed thugs on the streets, saw that. When the white supremacists are on the attack and you don't mention that you're going to go after people who attack black citizens, the enemy understands that means you're not going to do anything at all. Instead of giving us a hate crime law, Kamala Harris talked about marijuana and crypto regulations. She didn't even mention that black people are being attacked, wouldn't even acknowledge it. In May of this year, a black San Francisco resident, Terry Williams, who makes his living walking dogs, made national headlines when his home was burned down. Not surprisingly, he had been the subject of racial threats and harassment for 14 years. But nothing was done about it. 14 years. That means that this started the same year that Kamala Harris had become Attorney General of the state of California. But just like with Matrice Richardson, Kamala Harris turned a blind eye to crimes against black citizens. Reminds you of the crime report I posted 3 weeks ago talking about how Minneapolis police protected a violent white supremacist thug even after he shot and nearly murdered a black neighbor, and in fact the police chief himself publicly blamed the victim for almost being killed by a racist criminal instead of blaming the white supremacist himself. A criminal who had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood. There is an open, blatant, but unwritten rule among these anti-black government officials to protect white supremacists from any and all arrest or prosecution until after they kill. That's why they leave them on the loose. It is completely and thoroughly predictable that if you allow these criminals to remain on the streets breaking laws with impunity, sooner or later they'll become so emboldened to the point that they feel nothing will result in them being punished, even murder. And that's when they finally decide to step in. Maybe. This is why I call people like Dylan Roof and others the irregular forces of white supremacy. They're the ununiformed street terrorists who the police use to carry out the kind of racial ambushes that the cops think would be a little bit too risky for them to try. And of course, Mr. Williams wasn't alone. On September 1st, a black immigrant named Wendy Drew was racially threatened by a white Latino who then went on to brutally beat her until she had to be hospitalized. But it's specifically this kind of case that shows you why it is that this kind of thing goes on. The white media specifically went and found a black immigrant to report about. This woman is from South Africa, and she doesn't even have the courage to say black people. She instead says she's worried about what happens to people of color, and then she says women in general. People of color and women in general? This is why I keep harping on how suicidal and stupid the whole gender warring thing is. That's dysfunction planted in our community by white supremacy to divide us, and sadly, too many of us are only too glad to jump on that bandwagon to hell. This woman wasn't attacked because she's a woman. She was attacked because she's black. The anti-black racist who beat her half to death, he didn't say anything about her gender. He didn't throw any sexist remarks at her. It was all racial slurs. But she conveniently forgot about that. So why does she even bother to bring gender into it? Because she's trying to escape blackness by identifying as a woman first or as an immigrant first. This is what we see so many black immigrants do, but not just them. You got a number of black people who, whenever they or their loved ones are attacked, they're the first ones to try to take race out of it when race is the only reason that it happened. But focusing on immigrants for a moment, they're usually the first to talk as if they're not black, to say that in their home countries they're the racial majority. Yes, the poor majority. And that they don't need to identify as black. But when they get to the US, they try to do the same thing here too. Not because they think that it's true, but because back home they let the white supremacists dominate them there, and they get to the US trying to curry favor of the white supremacists who they should be trying to overthrow. Now, before I go any farther, I want all the immigrants who listen to me, and that includes the immigrants who are B1. This is why we as FBA have to delineate ourselves. And you, as immigrants, you also have to distance yourselves from these backstabbing elements too. As long as you refuse to, as long as you insist on the old dead talking point that, well, that's just them, and you don't do any more than that, then they are speaking for you. You have to call them out on it, because when you do so, that's going to have the most impact. But it's no coincidence that this kind of lunacy is happening in San Francisco. Shortly after Wendy Drew's story made headlines, San Francisco's so-called black leaders in the city met to have a do-nothing meeting and talk about anti-black hate crimes. That's all they were going to do, talk about it. They weren't going to do anything about it. And indeed, they didn't. This was just a PR stunt, but it did expose their utter impotence and uselessness. When Mr. Williams' home was burned down, San Francisco's black leaders didn't feel the need to do anything, but when an immigrant was the victim of violence, then they suddenly had to at least be seen to do something. Kamala Harris spent decades in San Francisco. September was the middle of this year's presidential campaign, so why didn't these so-called black leaders hold a press conference and declare that Kamala Harris cannot have their support unless she publicly campaigns to get an anti-black hate crime law passed? Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they demand that she campaign on that? Well, we already know why. Because the black misleadership class is actually the black traitor class, planted amongst us and established by white supremacy. And you won't be surprised to learn that the ringleader for this do-nothing gang is a guy named Reverend Amos Brown. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. You'll remember that Amos Brown was the alleged pastor at the church Kamala Harris claimed to attend. And he's also the president of the San Francisco NAACP, which infamously sent out a press release to the white media rebuking and opposing the idea of cash reparations. Amos Brown's name was literally at the top of that thing. So this is the guy talking about how something needs to be done for black residents in San Francisco to protect them from hate crimes. Yeah, black residents could start protecting themselves by removing bootlicks, sellouts, and traitors like Amos Brown, and make some people prominent who are going to stand up for black Americans and against white supremacy instead of playing footsie with the enemy. Now for the shills, plants, and suck-ups out there, you see Amos Brown helplessly asking who's going to do something about all these hate crimes. In a Democrat-run city, he has to do that. He's got to beg for his life in a Democrat-run city. A Democrat-run city in a Democrat-run state with a Democrat as president and a Democrat as vice president, a woman who used to be a member of Amos Brown's church, and yet he sits there as if there's nobody who can hear him crying out for mercy. Helpless. Now, I want for any of you shills out there to tell me, how is this any different than what you would expect if Trump was in the White House? All of the doom and gloom and apocalyptic talk you said about Trump, you may well be right, but my question is, how is this any different? Because we were told, you got to vote for Biden and you got to vote for Kamala because Trump will be worse. Will he be worse than this? If this was Ron DeSantis' Florida or Greg Abbott's Texas or that little reprobate down in Louisiana state or Mississippi or Tennessee or any other bastion of reprobate unreconstructed Confederates I was talking about, how would this be any different? All you cowards and clowns who 4 years ago were quaking in your boots about how terrible it would be if Trump got reelected. Meanwhile, the number of black people being murdered by the cops has gone up under Biden and Harris, higher than it ever was under Trump. The cops knew that Biden and Harris would protect them because Biden was on the campaign trail saying, as soon as I become president, I'm going to misallocate COVID funds to go to the thugs in blue, and I won't even require any policy changes or reforms by the police for them to get the money. I'll just hand it to them. He was openly declaring he would reward the police for killing black people. And that's the reason why the police have increased the numbers of ambushes and murders of black people as opposed to the Trump years. Not because Trump was such a good guy, he wasn't. Because of the fact that Trump knew that if he decided he was going to call himself locking arms with the police, he would immediately be met with an avalanche of accusations of racism, and rightly so. But my question is, why is it that you're able to see the racism from the orange man, but you can't recognize that that wrinkled up racist Biden is doing the exact same thing? If the only time you can call out anti-black racism is if somebody blatantly uses anti-black slurs, then that means you're too dumb to recognize an enemy when you see one. The police knew full well from Biden's history, especially the '94 crime bill, which he originally called Biden's law until it became a political liability. They knew that given his record and his bold statements that he was going to give the cops more money to kill with, they fully understood that what Biden was doing was giving tacit approval to increasing their attacks on black Americans, and that's exactly what the police did. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by, keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power tools, because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. The cowards who told us to vote for Biden 4 years ago, you didn't know it. No, that's wrong. You did know it. The black media told you every day. And by black media, I include everyone who listens to us. Because I don't have an audience, I've got fellow soldiers. And they argue with you online and in the streets, and you claim Biden was going to be better, that he would be different, that he would do something. Okay, here we are 4 years later. And what has Biden and Kamala Harris done for us? Please tell me how this situation is any different or any better than what you would expect under a Trump administration. For 4 years, I've been asking that question, and not one of you shills, bootlicks, and plants out there dares to answer it. Black people are the only ones fighting white supremacy. All these people claiming to be victims of hate crimes, and yet none of them stand up against or so much as call out the perpetrators of it. As an example, just last weekend, neo-Nazis were in the streets of Columbus, Ohio. So we can see that the Trump supporters are getting an early start on their inaugural celebrations. But as I've told you, this is going to be a repeat of 2020. But these chumps don't even have the sense to wait until after the orange man officially takes office. They're acting a fool, which is to say acting like themselves right now, while Biden is in office, while he's in the White House. And what is Biden doing about all this? He issued just a curt, brief statement saying that hate has no place in American society, and you can file that empty talking point under the same heading as the thoughts and prayers pablum that gets spouted after some member of the dominant society carries out a mass murder. This is Ohio we're talking about. The mayor of Columbus, Ohio is a Democrat. That's his town. So where were the police at to keep the trash corralled when they were marching in the streets? Most likely the police were among those racists. Just as we saw on January 6th, there were members of law enforcement who stormed the Capitol. See, when the enemy becomes emboldened, they come out of hiding. And this also forces Democrats to expose themselves and show everybody they're not going to do anything about it. These neo-Nazis were out there chanting all kinds of anti-black and anti-Semitic hate speech. Interesting, though, we didn't see some of the anti-racist activists like Christopher Rufo or Sean Hannity or Ron DeSantis interested in fighting this blatant actual hate speech. Gee, I wonder why. And you know who else wasn't interested in fighting it? Anyone outside of the black community. See, after this neo-Nazi march took place over the weekend, the few days later you had a group of black men who conducted their own Rally for Unity, they called it. An ironic name considering there was absolutely nobody else out there for them to unify with. Those black men were out there by themselves. These neo-Nazis were shouting slurs about black people, Jews, and all non-whites, and yet when these black men gathered to mount a counter-demonstration, they were the only ones there. Did the local Jewish synagogues not know about this? Did they not hear about the gang of white supremacists who were literally in the streets with swastika flags? Now, before we go any farther, the last time we had open displays like this was in 2020. And when that happened, people were forced to put down their iPhones and hit the streets. And that's what folks seem to be scared of. Half of them are scared, the other half of them apparently can't be bothered to. Apathy is the greatest ally of white supremacy. And the antidote to white supremacy on the march is black people going on the offensive. In every instance, when we rise up, they back down. But that takes effort, it takes consistency, it takes sacrifice, and nobody else is going to do it for you. Certainly not the Democrats. And a lot of black people fear that. They're terrified, not that they're going to get hurt, but that they're going to have to stop goofing off long enough to fight for their own survival. They want someone else to do it for them. That's why after Biden became president, the numbers of black people murdered by the police went up, not down. The numbers of black people killed by the police has been higher under Biden than it ever was under Trump. Why weren't people in the streets? Because with the 2020 election, a lot of those activists hit the snooze button. They fell for the white media lie that Trump was the problem. He was the entire problem. And that once he was gone, these problems would simply disappear. Well, they didn't. But what did go away was the white media attention on it, and for a lot of people, jumping in front of the cameras was their main motivation. You got to be seen twerking on CNN. And after all, those demonstrations are a good place to meet people, if you know what I mean. Well, they won't be able to hit the snooze button now, and this is exactly what we need. We keep letting ourselves be lulled to sleep with the lie that once the people who claim to be on our side are in office, well, all we need to do then is just sit back and wait for them to do something. This is what happened with Obama. Black people thought putting him in the White House meant that he would produce for the constituency that elected him. Instead, he chose to ignore us. That is, when he wasn't lecturing us. But denial is a hell of a drug. Even after 4 years of malign neglect, there were still black people who were desperately clinging to the delusion that Obama had been just pretending to be a sellout for the first 4 years, and that if he got a second term, then he would finally be free, quote unquote, to do all that stuff he didn't do during his first term. He just wanted to make sure he got a second term, don't you know? Of course, with his second term, all we got was more of the same, along with another lecture that you've got to secure my legacy. Now, I got to be able to hand the keys to the White House over to Hillary, so don't ask anything of me. We got to get the next person in there. Right back on the political treadmill and didn't even know it. Only then did it begin to dawn on some black folks that they had been conned. I guess it was just something that we had to go through, but we hadn't learned our lesson because we caved in 2020 to a man we knew from experience to be a racist and a liar, Joe Biden, along with his vice president, a woman who had a 30-year track record of weaponizing every political office she's ever held to go after black people, just like Obama had. As usual, black people are out there by ourselves. Where were the open-minded white politicians at in the 1960s when people were being lynched and homes being burned and churches being burned and firebombed and using real bombs? Where were they at? Were they out there marching with us? Where were they at to lend morale and public support to our marches, rallies, and demonstrations? Because the white supremacists and the KKK members who were killing black people in the 60s, they had no problem having politicians, including a few Democrats, who showed up in person to support them. So where were the white politicians who were supporting us at in the 1960s? The same place they're at right now. When those black men were marching this week, the Democrat mayor of Columbus wasn't out there with them. He wouldn't even meet with them. In the face of neo-Nazis with swastika flags having made national headlines, the mayor of Columbus gave no support to the community. Lip service is no service at all. You better remember that next year when the same people who have been in hiding right now all of a sudden come crawling out of the woodwork so they can jump out in front of one of our demonstrations and then claim in front of the cameras that they're speaking for the community. But in reality, all they're going to be doing is pushing the same old, and this is why we have to vote for the Democrats spiel, when it was the Democrats who allowed these vermin to fester amongst us in the first place. So since we're the only ones fighting the white supremacists, we're not letting anyone speak for us. And if somebody calls themselves jumping out in front of us, they're going to get slapped down. The neo-Nazis have always been their family. The only difference between now and 2 weeks ago is that they hadn't stepped forward to show who they were. Now you can see them. And that being the case, they have to be confronted. These other groups who claim to be so worried about these white supremacists, they're showing their true colors too. Because when it came time to fight the neo-Nazis, everyone was MIA except us. And we all know the reason why. It's because these other groups are looking for a place under white supremacy. They've been given a couple of small crumbs from the table, and as far as they're concerned, now they're fully on the team. Sure, they resent it when white supremacy feels the need to bring them in for some abuse, slap them around, and remind them of their place. But at the same time, as soon as white supremacy lets up on them a little bit, they go right back to picking the cotton. Well, as black people, we have to show that neither our backs nor our knees bend for anyone. We also have to demonstrate that there is a newly awakened knowledge of black empowerment on the march. We recognize exactly who our enemies are. And that being the case, we have absolutely no shame or bashfulness about letting everybody know we realize we have no friends. And that we also realize we got something better than friends. We've got family. And that family has a right to defend themselves, and we have a right to defend them. No matter who doesn't like it. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Cyberdyne100, Sean, Javier, Chevalier Foster, and Keegan Compton. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.